for being here early in the morning. Thanks for inviting me back to Rancho Mirage, this splendid conclave of readers and writers. Too bad you don't have nice weather in February here. I'm here this morning to talk about our origin story, and specifically The Fate of the Day, which is volume 2 in a trilogy that I'm writing about the American Revolution, and which will be published in April at the beginning of commemorations for our semiquincentennial. That's a 50-cent word for the 250th anniversary of our country's founding, and it also happens to be the theme of this year's Writers' Festival. This is my 8th book. All 8 have been about war, specifically 5 American wars over the span of 2 centuries. I spent 15 years writing about the American role in the liberation of Europe during World War II, and even before I finished the final volume of that trilogy, I was wondering what to do next, and I kept thinking about Jack London's advice that a writer ought not sit back and wait for inspiration, but ought to light out after it with a club. So I took my club, and what I found was our origin story, the American Revolution, which tells us who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and what they were willing to die for. That's the most profound question any people can ask themselves. Before we get to those weighty questions, let me set the stage a bit. Volume 1 of this trilogy, The British Are Coming, ends in the early spring of 1777. We've been at war with the British for 2 tumultuous, bloody years, from the first gunshots at Lexington and Concord, through surprising American victories at Sullivan's Island outside Charleston, at Great Bridge in Southern Virginia, Moores Creek near Wilmington, North Carolina. We've seen towns incinerated from Falmouth in Maine to Norfolk. We've seen the Americans declare their independence. This is Concord, and this is declaring independence. Huzzah! And we've seen a string of disastrous defeats for the American cause, from Long Island to Kips Bay and Fort Washington on Manhattan Island, and White Plains. So that not only did the British occupy New York City, but they chased the battered Continental Army across New Jersey, across the Delaware River, and into Pennsylvania. As the Continental Commanding General, George Washington, writes to his brother with great discouragement, "I think the game is pretty near up." Only Washington's surprise attack, born of desperation, back across the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, against the German garrison in Trenton, followed a few days later by another successful attack against the British rear guard at Princeton, salvages a hope before all parties retire to winter quarters in late spring 1777. Here's Washington on the Delaware. Well, that's where we are when The Fate of the Day begins, Volume 2. The new book opens not in New Jersey, but rather in France, at Versailles, with the king, Louis XVI, and his glamorous spendthrift queen, Marie Antoinette. She's known around the French court as Madame Deficit. Because the only way the Americans are going to defeat the British Empire and the Royal Navy, the greatest navy the world has ever seen, is to persuade France, a Roman Catholic absolute monarchy, to form an alliance with rebellious Protestant wannabe Republicans intent on committing treason against their lawful king, George III. The fellow responsible for convincing the French that this is in their best interest is a septuagenarian named Benjamin Franklin, who flits between Paris and nearby Versailles. Franklin has just enlisted a 19-year-old spindly redhead who happens to be one of the richest boys in France, Gilbert du Motier. You know him better as the Marquis de Lafayette. He's about to sail secretly against the king's orders from Bordeaux to America in the Victoire, the Victory, which is a ship that he has bought because he's been given a major general's commission in the American Army, although his military experience consists only of summer service in eastern France as a dragoon captain. You can't make this up. And so begins the second volume of the Revolution trilogy. This book recounts not only the efforts to bring France and then Spain into the war, turning an obscure brushfire revolt on the remote edge of the British Empire into a world war, but also the metastasis of rebellion in America into a savage civil war, with all of the heartbreak and internecine brutality that attend every civil war. It's an existential struggle, not only for the Americans seeking independence, but also for the British trying to preserve the first British Empire, which was barely a decade old when the Revolution began. So we again see the Americans lose more than they win at Ticonderoga, Brandywine, Germantown. That's our boy Lafayette. And that's Germantown. And we see more towns burned: Norwalk, Connecticut, Suffolk, Virginia, Esopus, New York, now called Kingston. But the rebels managed to hold strong just enough at Monmouth in New Jersey, at Bennington, and the two battles at Saratoga in New York to keep the army and the cause intact. They have enough scrappy, indomitable fighters like Benedict Arnold, who's the best tactical commander on either side in the first several years of the war, and John Paul Jones, who's an irascible, brawling immigrant Scottish sea captain, to keep the cause alive. And this volume draws to a close, spoiler alert, with a catastrophe in Charleston in May of 1780, when the British trap and capture an entire American army, 5,000 men. It's a disaster for the rebels, for us. That's John Paul Jones, and that's the siege at Charleston. So there, now you don't have to read the book. But you'll be ahead of the game when the semiquincentennial starts to unspool later this year. Like the bicentennial 50 years ago, this will be a national celebration, but also an opportunity to reflect on those big questions: who we are, what our forebears believed, what they were willing to die for. By the way, Ken Burns' next big film is a 6-part, 12-hour documentary on the American Revolution. I've been involved with it for quite a bit in the last couple of years, and it will air on PBS in November. I screened the rough cut with Ken and his Florentine Films gang in New York in the fall, and it's a gorgeous and compelling work of art, even as it explores discomforting themes of violence, slavery, and inhumanity. It's history with the bark stripped off, as history should be served. Let me suggest there's a lot to dislike about the founders and the war they waged for independence. The stirring assertion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 black slaves, 1 of 5 of all the souls living in America in the 13 colonies when those fine words were written in 1776. Nor was it valid for Native Americans, women, or indigents. In 1789, Benjamin Franklin died at the age of 84 in Philadelphia. But a few months before he passed, he wrote in a letter to a friend one of the lines for which he's best remembered. "Our new Constitution is now established. Everything seems to promise it will be durable. But in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes." What he's telling us, virtually from the grave, is that there's work to be done. The dream endures, but so does the struggle. The fate of the day, the title of this book that's coming out in April, is a phrase that recurs during the Revolution. I quoted a couple times, including in Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton's description of Washington during the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778 in central New Jersey, when things initially looked very grim for the Americans. Hamilton wrote, quote, "I never saw the general to so much advantage. By his own good sense and fortitude, he turned the fate of the day." The phrase implies destiny, contingency, events that may or may not be beyond the influence of human agency. The last time I spoke at Rancho Mirage, I mentioned that as I was researching Volume 1, the late Queen Elizabeth II opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owned as part of a project in England to digitize and catalog the papers from all four Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are almost 500,000 pages, most of them unpublished, most of them from the reign of George III, who was king for 60 years. And I was among the first allowed in for a whole month in 2016 at Windsor Castle, just west of London, where the papers are stored. Every morning I would show my badge at the Henry VIII gate to get into the castle. It's a real castle. And then I would show my badge again at the Norman gate, and then I would climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers in gorgeous, oversized red binders. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind. And he wrote not only most of his correspondence himself, and there you see our man, but he also made the copies. And that opportunity to spend time with George through his papers informed both my first volume and now this second volume about George, his family. Queen Charlotte produced 15 children. There she is. She looks pretty good. And about his reign. Charlotte had been an important partner, an advisor to George from the time they married, 6 hours after they met. He had the marriage bedroom decorated with 400 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish, because nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish. Valentine's Day is coming up, guys. Even as the war dragged on year after year, most Britons remained as committed to crushing the American insurgents as the king was. Let me mention one of them who is a central figure in the fate of the day, John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich. No one was more vital to the British cause. Sandwich is often at the king's elbow. He's the first Lord of the Admiralty. He's supervisor of both the Royal Navy, it's the Western world's largest industrial organization, and the Royal Dockyards, which are the largest employer in Britain. Sandwich is in his early 60s when he walks into our pages. He'd been orphaned young, inheriting his earldom at age 10. He was described by one acquaintance as a jolly, hearty, lively man with such a shambling gait that it was said he appeared to be walking down both sides of the street at one time. For years, he staged elaborate Christmas oratorios at his estate in Cambridgeshire, during which he played the kettle drums with dogged enthusiasm. And he put 2 slices of bread around a cut of meat so that he could eat with one hand while writing at his desk with the other. Voila, the sandwich. Sandwich, the man, not the meal, had more experience than any man in government. He's a formidable opponent. This was his third stint as head of the Royal Navy, and he'd also been a Secretary of State twice, despite being something of a rascal. One social club expelled him for blasphemy, and he allegedly took along what were described as ladies of pleasure on his trout fishing vacations. His wife bore him 5 children before mental illness crushed her. Declared legally insane, she was tucked away in a Windsor Castle apartment, and Sandwich took up with Martha Ray. She was a 16-year-old seamstress, 3 decades his junior. He hired instructors to teach her dancing, deportment, singing, French, and the harpsichord. As his consort, although never his social equal, Martha gave birth to 9 more of his children. In a particularly shocking scene on an April night in 1779, Martha was confronted by an infatuated, unhinged stalker as she emerged from the theater at Covent Garden. He clapped a pistol to her head and blew her brains out before trying unsuccessfully to kill himself. When Sandwich got the awful news that night, he cried, "I could have borne anything but this." Well, this personal calamity notwithstanding, trying to keep the Royal Navy in fighting trim while fighting a global war from North America to India required all of Lord Sandwich's skill, with shipyards working double shifts and on Sundays, admirals bickering over promotion, American privateers capturing hundreds of British merchant vessels during the war, and the prodigal use of press gangs, forcible conscription, often at gunpoint, to supply the 171,000 sailors needed by the Royal Navy during the Revolution, of whom 20,000 died of disease or battle injuries, and 42,000 deserted. That reflected what one sea captain called, quote, the confined birdcage-like space which seamen are obliged to live in on naval vessels. During the war, the king and his ministers, including Sandwich, embraced several strategic misconceptions in, for example, overestimating the depth of loyalist support across the American colonies and underestimating rebel resolve in confronting British firepower. Moreover, London believed, and it was an article of faith almost to the end of the Revolution, that allowing the American colonies to detach themselves from the empire would encourage insurrections in Canada, Ireland, India, the invaluable Sugar Islands in the West Indies. Dominoes would topple, threatening the imperial hegemony. This turned out to be no more correct in the 18th century than it was in the 20th century for us in Southeast Asia. Protecting and arming loyalists so that the good Americans, those who remained loyal to the crown, could help subjugate the bad Americans, the rebels, was a critical aspect of British strategy. But recent scholarship has determined that no more than 20% of the 2 million white Americans during the Revolution remained loyal, although loyalty was a slippery concept. It was contingent on shifting moods and events. At least 30,000 American loyalists would fight for the crown, from drummer boys to field-grade officers, and perhaps twice that number. But that was never enough to tip the scales during the war. None of the 13 states, the colonies became states with the Declaration of Independence, none of those 13 states remained under loyalist control after 1775, despite pockets of loyal strength along the western frontier from New York to Georgia and in maritime regions of the mid-Atlantic states. Despite few military victories for the rebels, virtually all levers of power, from municipal committees of safety to state governments and the National Congress, remained under insurrectionist control. On the American side of the hill, the first among equals, of course, is somebody you know, this guy, George Washington. As early as 1778, when he's 46 years old, there are references to him as the father of the country. Alexander Hamilton, his aide-de-camp, described him as a man, quote, to whom the world is offering incense. Now, he's hardly without flaws. He could be vain and moody with a molten temper. The man who proverbially could never tell a lie sure could prevaricate. At least 577 slaves lived at Mount Vernon during Washington's lifetime there. That's appalling. One of those slaves said, "I never see that man laugh to show his teeth. He'd done all his laughing inside. Well, part of that certainly reflected 20 years of dental misery that kept Washington tight-lipped. He eventually wore dentures made from cow and human teeth, some of the latter purchased from the enslaved, as well as elephant and hippo ivory set in lead. But part of it was because, as one of his aides wrote, the weight of the whole war may justly be said to lay upon his shoulders. He could be impenetrably reserved and opaque. One portrait painter noted his, quote, remarkably dead eye when Washington chose to hide the inner man or discourage familiarity. Thomas Jefferson believed that his mind was, quote, slow in operation, being aided little by invention or imagination, but sure in conclusion. He was a pretty indifferent tactician. And since July 1775, when he took command of the new Continental Army, his generalship had been a medley of misfortune, miscalculation, disaster, and occasionally bold aggression at places like Trenton and Princeton. There he is at Princeton. Good luck attended him. What's the trait that Napoleon most cherished in his generals? Luck. Good luck attended Washington in providential fogs, stumbling enemies, and bullets that barely missed. John Adams, who was wary of what he called the superstitious veneration accorded Washington by many of his fellow Americans, nevertheless conceded that his great, manly, warlike virtues reassured the public, as did his rectitude and his readiness to sacrifice self-interest for the greater good. And the truth is that he embodied those classical virtues cherished by his countrymen: fortitude, prudence, temperance, and the subordination of private advantage to public benefit. One steady line of conduct for the good of the great whole, as Washington put it. Do we care about these virtues anymore? He repeatedly refused to use his power for his own ends. He could be cunning, but rarely a conniver. He consciously tried to emulate the Roman republicans he admired, notably Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, a Roman military leader who saved Rome on the battlefield, but then put away his sword to retire to his farm. One Washington staff officer wrote that, quote, for attention to business, perhaps he has no equal. He had an adhesive memory, a passion for detail, and a mind organized for executive action. He once took fencing lessons to become more nimble, and generalship kept him nimble intellectually, able to handle complex tasks simultaneously, from supply and recruitment minutiae to strategic planning, and a vast correspondence with Congress, state governors, and hundreds of his army subordinates. His constitution, like his will, seemed built from iron. Other than occasional intestinal distress and infrequent touches of malaria, he remained robust and durable for 8 years during the Revolution. John Adams noted that he had what Adams called the gift of silence, a gift conspicuously absent in Adams, who could be a bit of a gas bag. Washington certainly could kvetch at times. As the 1777 campaign season was about to begin, he complained to his stepson, "I do not think that any officer since the creation ever had such a variety of difficulties and perplexities to encounter as I have." Washington ultimately used more than 100 names for a supreme being, often invoking Providence, less frequently God, almost never Jesus Christ, although he wanted each of his men to act like, quote, a Christian soldier. In acknowledging what he called the uncertainty of human things, he sometimes echoed the classical Stoics, notably Seneca, a first-century Roman who advised, "It is a rough road that leads to the heights of greatness." Washington's preeminent task as commanding general was, of course, to lead the Continental Army. The Army was a fulcrum on which the fate of the nation balanced, the transformational agent in the ascent from colonial backwater to sovereign power, a republic struggling to be born. It was also the unifying element in the American body politic. Perhaps 250,000 American men bore arms in the Patriot cause, about half in the Continental Army and half in state militia regiments manned by part-time soldiers. But by 1777, the Army was changing significantly. Rabid enthusiasm for the Patriot cause had faded since 1775, when the ranks had been filled with propertied freeholders and tradesmen, many of whom subsequently returned to their farms, their tanneries, their shops, because they had families or businesses they could no longer ignore. Instead, the Army increasingly depended on the landless young, the poor, the desperate, sometimes the shiftless. It's a recruiting rally. These ranks included apprentices, farmhands, servants, the unemployed, drifters, and recent immigrants, notably Irish Protestants driven to America by crop failures and a collapse of the weaving industry. As many as a quarter of Continental troops were Irish. They needed income, even if it was only the $6 a month that a private earned. States began conscripting troops, sometimes with names drawn from a hat, although they permitted the hiring of substitutes for Continental service or buying exemptions by paying a fine. In New Jersey, drafted masters enrolled their slaves or indentured servants in their stead in the Army. Up to 40% of that state's Continental troops were substitutes. Marylanders began forcing vagrants into the Army. Desertion was such a persistent problem that Washington warned that, quote, "we shall be obliged to detach one half of the Army to bring back the other half." In a May 1780 letter to his cousin Lunt, who served as overseer at Mount Vernon during Washington's absence, the general wrote, "You ask, how am I to be rewarded for all this? There is one reward that nothing can deprive me of, and that is the consciousness of having done my duty with the strictest rectitude and the most scrupulous exactness, and the certain knowledge that if we should ultimately fail in the present contest, it is not owing to the want of exertion in me." In an era of great men, he already was in the front rank. Have no illusions that there was anything antiseptic about the revolution. This is a woman named Jane McCrae, who was murdered by Indians working for the British in upstate New York. There is nothing civil about civil war. There was a brutal cycle of violence and retribution. A Lutheran pastor outside Philadelphia wrote, "Everywhere, distrust, fear, hatred, and abominable selfishness. Parents and children, brothers and sisters, wife and husband were enemies to one another." This is the Battle of Bennington, carrying wounded Germans into a makeshift hospital. And of course, combat itself was a savage bloodletting. In the first Battle of Saratoga at Freeman's Farm on September 19, 1777, an estimated 150,000 one-ounce lead bullets were fired by both sides. And a one-ounce lead bullet can do frightful things to a human body. American battle casualties exceeded 300. The wounded often left overnight on the battlefield in sub-freezing temperatures to be stripped by scavengers or scalped by Indians. British casualties approached 600, including a 16-year-old lieutenant, Stephen Harvey, who, upon being told that his wound was mortal, accepted a surgeon's advice to avoid further agony by taking a massive dose of opium. Young Harvey shared a grave with two other British lieutenants, neither older than 17. As often occurred after 18th century battles, the effects of officers killed in action were auctioned off to their comrades. This is General Fraser, who was killed at Saratoga, being buried even as the battle was going on. So the dead, again, after these auctions, moved among the living, at least in a fine hat here, or a set of shoe buckles there, a brace of pistols, perhaps a spyglass. And anguish in this war often had nothing to do with gunfire. Sergeant Oliver Reed was a 31-year-old veteran in the 4th Connecticut Regiment who had served the cause since the earliest days of the war. At Valley Forge, in the horrible winter of 1777-78, he received a letter from his wife, Betty, who told him that typhus had killed 3 of their 4 children, all under the age of 6. Of their son, Chester, not yet 3, she wrote, "I never see anybody die in such distress as he did. He had his senses till the last, and the last word he said was, 'I'm a-coming, I'm a-coming, I'm a-coming.'" Sergeant Reed, heartsick beyond comprehension, would follow his duty at Valley Forge, but he too was a-coming. Death claimed him before he'd given another year to the cause. And Betty, now widowed with only one surviving child, would inform Oliver's family, "Bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh is gone and is no more among the living, but is congregated with the dead." The American War of Independence would last 3,059 days. The struggle included more than 1,300 military actions, some large and bloody, like Brandywine, others small and bloody, plus 241 naval engagements. These middle years of the war that I describe in this book are full of misery, death, doubt, suffering. By the end of 1778, at least 19,000 of King George's troops in America are listed as dead, deserted, discharged, or captured. 19,000. For the Americans, at least 1 in every 10 men who fought in the Revolution died during the war. It's a larger proportion of our American population to perish in any conflict other than the Civil War. The odds were stacked against the Americans, against us. No colonial rebellion had ever succeeded in casting off imperial shackles. Yet even when things were darkest, an indomitable persistence and faith in the future persisted. It endured. Not in every patriot heart, and not without despair, but in enough hearts and with enough hope to fight on. Ebenezer Stanton, a Connecticut Army paymaster, wrote to a friend, "I could wish I had 2 lives to lose in defense of so glorious a cause. I was free-born, and if I can support myself, I will stand or fall in defense of my country." My country. That concept had taken root in the American seedbed, nurtured by a shared faith in this struggle, ostensibly about taxes, autonomy, and other parochial complaints, but it was ultimately about the chance to build both a new nation and a better world. Captain John Marshall of Virginia, who survived Brandywine, Germantown, Monmouth, Valley Forge, Stony Point, and was destined to become Chief Justice of the United States for 34 years, wrote, "I was confirmed in the habit of considering America as my country and Congress as my government. I had imbibed these sentiments so thoroughly that they constitute a part of my being. Faith in the future sustained an irrational optimism despite all the obvious perils." During the dreary winter of 1778-79, when the Continental Army was camped in bivouacs in northern New Jersey, Washington and his officers organized a homely celebration to commemorate the first anniversary of the French alliance with the American cause. 13 cannons fired a salute, an army band played. The guests wandered through 13 illuminated arches with paintings depicting scenes from the war. The first shots at Lexington, the triumph at Saratoga. There's Saratoga, the burning of Falmouth, Norfolk, and other towns. A final arch, the 13th arch, imagined a future peaceable America as was described as a rising empire. Her rivers covered with merchant ships and new canals traversing the land. This is why they're fighting, suffering, dying. They see peace, prosperity, a land stretching from sea to shining sea. They see you. America is predicated on an idea that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That should act as a pole star to provide true north, telling us what it is that we think we can do as a people. The perpetual challenge of the American experiment is to draw on these aspirational ideals, to make them our own, to hand them off to our children and grandchildren, and to use that as a propulsion system for being the nation that those forebears thought we could become. Thank you again for having me here today. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Don't tell Jamie, we're not supposed to take questions in this room, but we'll take a couple. We got a few minutes, and I will repeat the question so you can hear. Sir.
Was the American Revolution inevitable, or are there things that Britain could have done, like allowing representation in Parliament?
Yeah. Was the American Revolution inevitable? Could Britain have done things to ward it off, like allowing American representation in Congress? Nothing is inevitable, in my view, in history. There are always contingencies and decisions and errors that make things happen that wouldn't necessarily have to happen. My feeling is that by the time you get to 1775, it's pretty inevitable. And once the gunfire starts and the man on your left is wounded and your buddy on your right is killed and the blood is flowing, then it's going to be fought to the finish. There were proposals that the British allow American representation in Parliament. Physically, it's difficult. It's a 6-month round trip across the Atlantic in the best of times. There was really no appetite in the way the British body politic was set up to extend the right of representation to the Americans. You know, for Britain, we were a cash cow. And that's how they thought of us. We provided raw materials that were used by British industry to create finished goods that were then sold back to us and around Europe. And it made Britain rich. And they didn't want to mess that up. Sir.
How did John Marshall's experience in the war influence his later justiceship as supreme?
Yeah, how did John Marshall's experience in the war? As I mentioned, he was a young officer. His father was a regimental commander from Virginia. Marshall served in his father's unit for a while. And how did it affect his tenure on the Supreme Court? I'm not an expert on Marshall and his Supreme Court tenure. I do know, and he writes about it very explicitly and frequently, that it is the salient experience of his life, as it is for so many others. I write a lot about World War II, and those 16 million Americans, I'm going to talk about it this afternoon here, those 16 million Americans who were in uniform during World War II, for many of them, that is the salient experience of their life. It forms who they are as a consequence of the experience they've had, of the danger that they've experienced in some cases, of the camaraderie that they've felt, of the sense of serving a cause larger than themselves. And for Marshall, that was certainly the case. He felt, as that quote I read indicates, that he was part of something bigger than he was. We are looking for that, aren't we? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know what you think about them changing or not teaching the American history.
What do I think about them not teaching American history? Oh, I'm all for it. Yeah, well, at your peril. If you don't know where you came from, if you don't know who you stand on, if you don't know what the country believes, you're going to have trouble making good civic decisions as a people. And I know there is an erosion of teaching history, the humanities generally. I speak as an old English graduate student. I'm appalled. And I just think it's penny wise, pound foolish. I think that the challenge is to make it engaging. This happened 250 years ago. For kids today, it might as well have been 250 BC. And the challenge is to bring it to life, to show direct connections with life today, to enliven it with people who are really people, who have the same foibles, the same anxieties as anybody, including 15-year-olds in high school. So, you know, that's a big load to put on teachers and school systems, but it's a load that must be addressed because if we grow up ignorant about our history, we've got trouble. It just seems self-evident to me. Okay, we got time for one more.
Here you go.
Sir.
In your opinion, what are the several or the one most important reason the United States was successful in waging this war?
What was the one reason that the U.S. was successful in waging this war? I'm sorry, we're out of time. You know, they were successful mainly because the war lasted 8 years across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail. It was a matter of bleeding them 1,000 cuts, eroded British will. It helped that the British did not have particularly good generals here through those 8 years. There were some fine officers, but the commanding generals tended to not be up to snuff, not up to the task. And the fact that even though it was a close-run thing many times, the Army, Washington, Congress, which was as inept as it ever has been at times, nevertheless had a sense of we're going to keep on doing this as long as it takes because we believe in what we're doing. We believe in the future that we see. And so that is the primary reason that it succeeds. Although it takes 8 years and it takes thousands and thousands of deaths, it takes many burned towns, and you never know almost until the final shots whether it's going to be successful. Thanks again so much for having me.